Hi, in this video I want to go over the strategies and process of Lightroom development. Now, all of you are familiar with Lightroom. You're familiar with the basic development panel. So this is not an introduction to the development panel. You should also already be quite familiar with that, although I'll do a couple reminders on the way. This really is about talking you through the strategy of looking at a raw file and making an ordered group of decisions about how to develop and improve that file. Not about making it crazy or weird. I know that, that there's often people who don't want to develop their files at all because they want them to be natural and pure. Remember that raw files actually come out of the camera with a little bit of lack of sharpness, sometimes a slight overexposure if we're exposing to the right. They're raw information, so they have not yet had anybody make decisions about how they look. So we're not going to be doing dramatic, crazy things to them. We're going to, my view is always that I'm trying to make the photograph look more the way that I visualized it and imagined it. Okay, so we're going to start with this photo of bison that I took a few years ago in Golden Gate Park. I was really lucky. It was this great day when the bison were actually running around, which is very, very unusual. I had my long lens with me, and I managed to capture this wonderful vision of this bison running past. It was really great. Now, the other thing that I'm going to be talking about when I talk about this strategy, this is part of the strategy of development, is global versus local development. So as I go through with this bison, which is a good shot, I'm going to talk about how we start doing overall adjustments, really looking at it and saying, well, what kind of overall adjustments do we need to make? And then we come in and we start to do local adjustments. This is really like as if you were in painting where you're sketching it out and then you're coming in and doing the small areas. A lot of beginning photographers make the mistake of trying to come in and fix little tiny things before they do their global development. Oftentimes that global, that bigger development is going to take care of those problems first, and then you can come in and make those micro decisions. Okay, let me show you how that works. So first of all, before we get started, I'm just going to take this left panel out because we don't need to look at it while we develop. We're in the develop module, and we can just make this a little bigger, give ourselves a little bit more space to work, and work our way from top to bottom down this panel. Now, the first place that you're going to look, of course, you will remember this, is, the histogram. And if the histogram isn't showing, be sure to pull it down. I know a lot of beginning photographers find this histogram thing really boring. I cannot tell you how important it is to look at your histogram and understand it. Now, one of the reasons I chose this photo to start is that this is actually really great out of the camera. It looks really good. The histogram is awesome. You notice that there's no clipping on either side. The exposures are all pretty much right in the middle, some into the light shadows, some into the highlight areas. Remember, we have whites, highlights, midtones, shadows, and then the black areas here. So these are really up into the midtones and the highlights. And that's ideal because we know we have lots of information to work with, so we can really do almost whatever we want with this photograph. So that's the first thing. The next thing we want to do is to actually zoom in and check the focus. Now, for me, and this varies for people, it depends on what kind of photograph you're taking, but with a photo like this, I'm not concerned with every little thing in the photo being in perfect focus, but I want to make sure in this case that his eye and his mouth, because those are the first places we go to, that those are in focus. So we zoom in, and these are a tiny, tiny bit. They're actually have a little bit of motion blur. They're actually sharp, but just a little bit of motion blur. I'm really happy with it. Look, we can actually see that saliva coming out of his mouth. And even though the area around his eye, we've got a little motion blur there, his eye itself is really sharp. And we can actually sharpen that up more in our development. So I'm pretty happy with that. The foreground, the background are a little soft. That's great. But where he is, and actually if we look at the rest of him, you can see his fur. All of these areas are really wonderfully detailed. So Yeah, this is going to be a good photo to develop. The other thing I'll point out, this is actually the full raw file, undeveloped, full 6,000 by 4,000. I haven't cropped it yet. So I had a good tight shot. I have a lot to work with. One of the great things about a raw file is you start with a whole lot of pixels, a whole lot of information, so that if you have to make changes and you start to throw things out and rearrange them, you have a little working room. With a JPEG or a smaller file, once you start to adjust it, things get kind of gnarly and ugly. Okay, we'll take that off. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and crop it. And I don't mind the crop, I'm nice and close, but I just feel like if I cropped it a little bit, and we try not to get carried away with this because we don't want to take away too much information, but I feel like if I went in just a little bit, change the aspect ratio slightly, that I could make this photo a little bit more about the bison. Yeah, and that just pops him forward. I like that. That's all I want to do for that. This is all about the bison, so I want to do everything that I can to actually adjust that. Okay, so I'm going to work my way down. These are all local tools. We're going to come back to those. I'm going to work my way down the panel. The temperature looks good. I tend to look at the light temperature, maybe do a little test on an area that could be neutral gray, maybe his tongue, but I don't like that. I'm going to do a Command Z. I think the warmth, I think it's just fine, so I'm going to leave it be. It doesn't look wrong. The exposure looks great. I actually could have exposed a little bit more to give myself more information, but I'm just going to leave it there. I don't usually use contrast. You might know that about me. I'm going to leave that be because I think I have more control down here. That's my feeling about it. Highlights, this area here, don't need to adjust those because they're all nice and rich. The brightest highlight we have is here, and it already has texture and detail, so don't need to brighten them up or take them down. But the shadows, I would say, I really want to pull those shadows up just a little bit, because the very darkest areas, I know that we have detail in there because I saw it on the histogram. And so I just want to pull it up so you can start to see some of the detail here. And I'll take it down so you can see it again. Remember with these sliders, if you double click them, they'll go back to the beginning. And notice how, oh, look at that. We can start to see the hairs in there. Some people like to use the numbers in here. I'm more of an intuitive slider person. And I'll zoom back out again. Okay. Whites and blacks, I don't really feel like the blacks need to go anywhere. However, and I'm going to do this zoomed out at first and then I'll zoom in. Here's one of my little tricks. I like to take the whites up. Just the whites. Remember, that's this area here. And it just will snap the photo to a little bit. So I'll just show you the difference. It tends to just give a little snap to the whole thing. That's my little personal trick. Okay. Next down here we have presence. These are really wonderful, powerful tools. Definitely when you're doing animal photos, and we'll go ahead and zoom in here, the texture is really helpful. It sort of grabs at the edges. You can see how that's emphasizing those hairs. This looks really great over here. Needs to be distinguished from clarity. Clarity is an awesome tool. It can be overused. Clarity ups the contrast of the midtones. So watch this area, these areas here, because it's just going to change the contrast of the midtones. You can go way too far, things start to look really weird and strange. Clarity is always something you want to use just a little bit, but see how that just snaps that up. We don't need any dehaze here, and I really don't think we need any vibrance and saturation. As a matter of fact, I actually think that I want to try to desaturate part of this. So let me show you a little bit, one of my favorite tricks, especially for nature photography. I'm going to go into the HSL panel, and remember in the HSL panel, that's hue, saturation, and luminance, we can control the hue, the saturation, and luminance of individual colors. I always find a problem with the yellows and the greens of in nature photos. They really kind of overwhelm the animals. This beautiful brown bison just can't compete with that. So I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to take the saturation of both the green and the yellow down a little bit. There we go, and we can play with this. I'm also going to take the luminance of the green and the yellow down. And you can see that that just, there we go, a little bit more. So I'll show you the difference between those two. This is without, and this is with. Whoops, there we go. So it just sort of darkened and made those areas subtle. I think I'm actually going to take the yellow saturation down just a tiny, whoops, I don't want to go too far, a little bit more. Maybe that's too far. Okay, there we go. I like it that way. I can always come back and adjust it because this is Lightroom. It's magic. I can do things in my, come back and readjust that in a different way. That's it for the global adjustments. I want to come in now and show you local adjustments. So local adjustments, I know you might be looking at this and saying, this is fine. Why would you do some local adjustments? Again, this is the exciting part. I can come in and I can start just refining and playing and making this just a little bit more focused and clean. I'm actually going to start with the healing tool. This is where I like to start. Oops. And I am not going to visualize spots. I'll tell you about that in a later video. So that's down here. If that comes up and you get that crazy look, just turn that off down here. I always zoom in when I'm working with my, oops, I'm going to do that to start. I like to zoom in before I get into my healing tool. You have the capacity to change things here, the feathering, the opacity, and the size. Remember, you can also do with brushes, and I'll give you a look at my favorite development shortcuts. One of my very favorite development shortcuts is actually the bracket keys for, and I'll move this over here, so you can make this bigger and smaller on the slide. You can also change, and in this case, I think I'm going to change the feathering just a little bit. And sometimes when I'm healing, I like the opacity down just a tiny bit. Now, with healing, you want to make sure that your brush isn't too much bigger than the thing that you're going to heal. Otherwise, you can get some kind of crazy, excuse me, some kind of crazy artifacts. So I'm going to take this down just a little bit, and I just want to take some of this debris out of his fur. And remember that with this, you can move this around a little bit where it's grabbing things from, just to make it a little bit more effective. Okay, that looks good. And I don't want to take all this spittle out because that's kind of cool, but I might take out just a couple of these little dots just to focus it. And there we go. And I'll call it, I'm not going to call it done for that yet because, well, no, I will. I'll bring up another brush. So call this done. So I want to zoom out again, and I want to do a correction that doesn't have anything to do with the with correcting things. This isn't something that's wrong. It's just distracting to me. So whenever I'm looking at an image, if there's something like this little white spot, I know there's nothing wrong with that. That was there. It's natural. It's normal. But it actually keeps pulling my eye away from where I want to be. So I'm just going to use my healing tool, my spot tool, and I'm going to make it big enough, and I'm just going to brush over that area. And again, you might need to, oh, it's going very slow. There we go. And with that, it's mushy enough that I think we're going to get away with that. And we zoom out again, and you can see that now we would never know that that had been there, but it's actually taken that look away. Okay, there's a couple other places I might do that with, but I want to show you one last thing before we move on to the next video, and that is to use the Radial tool just to give this a little bit of a focus, of a vignette. So this is the Radial tool. You have this tool, which I'll show you, which is the graduated filter. This is the Radial tool and the Radial filter. And this works very much like other filters, and we're going to get into a few of those other local tools where you actually have the option of doing a number of different things. We're just going to do, with this one, we're just going to do exposure. So I'm just going to grab this, oops, and I'm going to pull this down. And I've got my, and this is handy, I've got my selected mask overlay on here, and that is helpful. I can actually come down here. I'm going to change the feathering just a little bit. And so this masking is showing me where this effect is going to be. And that's really helpful. The red won't be there, remember? And what I'm trying to do is to create just a little subtle vignette. This could go way too far, so I'm going to be cautious, but I'm just setting my parameters right now. I'm going to feather it just a little bit more. I can invert it, but this right now is going to act on the outside. So I'm going to uncheck that overlay so that we can see it normally, and then I'm just going to bring my exposure down. So I still, there we go. Sorry, it's acting a little slow. So now that would be way too much. Let's let it catch up. I don't want it to look obvious. I just want to put a little bit on, just to put kind of a spotlight on that bison, just a tiny bit. Okay, and there we go. And that's all I'm going to do for him right now. I just want to show you the beginning. I'm going to go into the history so you can see all the steps that we took. And I'll show you what it was like before we started working. That's where we started. And that's where we ended. So you can see, still looks natural, but just a very different photo. Okay, that was a relatively long introductory video. I'm going to stop there, take a break, come back, and in the next video I'm going to show you a couple of different scenarios so you can get some more thoughts about how to do this process of development.